those joints, pack those bowls, and fire up those nails. Because you're listening to Blazin with Bobby Black.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Blazin. I'm your host, Bobby Black. Over the past several years, the momentum behind marijuana legalization has been growing. Public support is now at an all-time high. Over half of the United States have medical marijuana. 4 states have full legalization for adults, and it's estimated that more will soon follow. It seems that after decades of misinformation, propaganda, and oppression, the forces of prohibition are finally beginning to lose, and the nation is waking up to the fact that the war on drugs has been an abject failure. Huge strides are being made that only 5 or 10 years ago seemed unimaginable to me. So why now? What's changed? Well, first of all, the internet age has allowed the average person access to tons of information and studies that they never had access to before. Another huge factor, which is undeniable, is the entrance of big business and money into the cannabis community. And yet another big factor is simply generation gap. The fact that up until now, the people in charge were from a bygone era, and now the baby boomers are in a position of power. They're the elder statesmen, and they're more familiar with marijuana. They've had experiences with it. They've had exposure to it, so they're not as terrified of it. Well, all of these factors, I believe, are serving as very important catalysts in this transformation from a prohibition mindset to a legalization mindset in America. I think it's imperative that we don't forget who and what laid the groundwork that made all of these changes possible. And that is the decades and decades of hard work and sacrifices of activists, people who believe in the cannabis plant, believe in its healing powers, believe in its creative powers, and believe in the rights and liberties of human beings to enjoy it and ingest it without being ostracized or jailed for it. Now, obviously, there are countless individuals and numerous prominent organizations that have devoted their lives and their energies to this noble cause. And today we're going to discuss one of the oldest and most respected of these organizations, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, also known as NORML. To discuss NORML's history and their role in the legalization movement, past, present, and future, please welcome to the show NORML's Executive Director, Mr. Alan St. Pierre. How you doing, Alan?
G'day, Bobby.
It's nice to talk to you again. It's been a while.
Yes, it's been a while, but so much happens in between that's good regarding marijuana law reform.
Yeah, so let's just jump right into it. Tell me a little about what's on your plate at the moment, what you're dealing with.
Well, the big things ahead of us in 2016 are broken into 3 basic categories. One is the initiatives. There looks to be 6 to 7 states that are going to have marijuana legalization initiatives. That's really important, notably with California leading the way. And the second is that Congress will have at least 20 to 30 marijuana law reform bills reintroduced. Some of them will range from legalization to sentencing to medical to hemp to banking regulations, but it's all good. That's all reflective of the fact the states are moving in a different direction. And then, of course, this is a presidential election year, so we can see already from the beginning of the process that we've got people on the Democratic side, like someone like a Bernie Sanders, that would legalize marijuana if he had his choice. And on the other side, we have someone like a Chris Christie who would say, make me president and I'll end the pot party, the first day of my presidency in the states where it's been legal. So for the first time in any of our lifetimes, marijuana is debated and discussed at the presidential level, and obviously whoever wins will have a very big impact on the future. If it happens to be a Democrat or somebody who's in favor of these reforms, then we're probably going to see reforms happen a lot faster at the federal level. If we don't, if we get somebody who's like a stick in the mud, well, that'll be a bummer, but it's not going to stop a number of other states to keep putting pressure on the federal government. So this looks to be the busiest year ever for marijuana law reform organizations.
Obviously, Sanders seems to be the standout, the strongest candidate pro-cannabis in this race. But how big of a danger is it really? Like, if you were to get a Christie in office, he's threatening to stop the legalization train in its tracks and send us back to the Stone Age, so to speak. But, but can he really undo everything that's been done, or you think it's too late for that?
Yeah, to use a metaphor, I think the genie, the green genie, if you will, is really out of the bottle, and there's no way that a federal politician like the president, even with the power that they have, can do that. And the reason why I suggest that is because we can see in a state like Colorado, the legislature back in 2010, they too could see that marijuana was going from being sort of an underground medical marijuana situation to one where it was showing up on the main streets all around the state, and they chose to, rather than put the genie back in the bottle, recriminalize marijuana, crack down on it, they acknowledged, no, it would be much better to tax and regulate it, and they did so. So I don't think that the federal government can do what a state government itself has acknowledged it can no longer do. The other thing that people don't really realize is that even if, say, Mr. Christie were to succeed, or, for that matter, the states of Kansas and Oklahoma who are suing Colorado to get it to change its legalization laws, if they prevail, if they were to prevail, all they can do is stop the sale and taxation. But the voters have said that they don't want to have prohibition anymore. So in essence, these anti-marijuana folks in Oklahoma and Kansas and Mr. Christie, if they prevail, beware what they ask for, because what they would get is states that have no regulations, no policies. That means you and I could go out and sell marijuana to a 12-year-old. So
I kind of had a different career path in mind, but sure, why not?
So even if they prevail, they would lose in the sense that they really wouldn't set up a system that's any better than prohibition. One could argue it would be more chaotic than prohibition.
It seems pretty obvious that Colorado has been the leader in showing us how it should be done, as far as creating sensible science and rational regulations on the industry, and just trying to incorporate it into a normalcy, I guess. I know that Washington has been kind of struggling, and I think the issues that Washington and Oregon are having is because they're letting the liquor board control it. Would you agree with that?
Yes, you pointed to a very important distinction between the way Colorado set up their system and that of Washington and Oregon. And in those two other states, Oregon and Washington, they did defer and place marijuana in the same regulatory scheme as alcohol. And so therefore, there's been lots more restrictions and tax proposals and fees, and less freedom of choice and commerce for producers and consumers. So right now, when we want to show state legislators or politicians from other countries, and they want to come to the United States and do what we call like a pro-legalization junket, we often, almost exclusively, bring them through Colorado and show them that system as the preferred one, rather than to go out to Oregon or Washington.
It seems like there's really not their system they're trying to implement. I know that the patients seem to not be happy with the situation because their recreational laws are interfering with the medical setup there, and it seems like they're just kind of muddling through it, and they don't really have a plan. I mean, wouldn't they look to a state that really has more sensible things going on and say, gee, maybe we should try some of those ideas?
Yeah, there's no doubt that Oregon and Washington, the legislators and the regulators, seem to really have a bad view of medical marijuana in general and seek to largely stamp it out in terms of a standalone commerce, or that it has its own subculture around it. And thankfully, Colorado has not gone that route. You really do have both recreational, if you will, and medical marijuana operating very closely next to each other in tandem. There's not a lot of problem, and consumers and patients have tremendous choices, hundreds, thousands of different products. But in Washington and Oregon, it looks like it may be the end of the last 20 years or so of the so-called medical marijuana dispensary model, which, at least at NORML, we don't support. We support, whether it's recreation or medical, that they're able to operate in a reasonably unfettered environment and have definitely no greater restrictions than, say, a package store or a bar has on it.
Sure, because there's been tremendous hurdles placed in the way of recreational shops and medical shops in various states, like very large fees just to apply for licenses and a lot of other hurdles, correct?
Absolutely. In fact, for reformers, while we still have the two-tier mission ahead of us of working to reform the laws and at the same time helping the victims. I mean, 700,000 people a year are still getting busted for pot. There are still about 100,000 people in jail or prison. We count at least 20 or more people in jail for life for marijuana offenses in the United States. So while those two important two-tier missions are ahead of us, for the reformers, groups like NORML, MPP, ASA, LEAP, etc., once marijuana becomes legal and it's taxed, we still have work ahead of us in lots of areas, including things like making parity with alcohol products, to make it so that, for example, if you are a gun owner, that you don't have your Second Amendment rights violated by the fact that you legally use marijuana, that your children aren't taken away from you, that you're not drug tested for not cause incidences in the workplace, reasonable DUID laws and penalties and the science behind it. So there'll be so much work in the future to try to, once marijuana laws are reformed, to try to then improve them and make them much better. Of course, we've got to get these thousands of people out of jail where possible, get them reparations if they were wrongly put in jail. There is so much work to be done long after marijuana is legally sold and taxed.
Sure, and I know that Obama has recently granted some clemency to some drug war prisoners and started releasing some of them, which is fantastic, and it's great news. Obviously, as you say, there's many more people that it's not just a handful. There's a lot of people that really should be let out. Tell the listeners a little about what you guys actually do. I mean, I know that most of it is lobbying efforts to politicians and to interest groups and stuff, but talk a little about what your day is like and what you guys do.
Sure. So NORML is the oldest and largest of the marijuana law reform groups, and it has 160 chapters. So we really put the grass in the grassroots of all of this. Those chapters really are the sort of where the rubber meets the road on marijuana law reform. These are the men and women that go to the town hall meetings and the Kiwanis Club meetings and the Knights of Columbus, and they hold up the protest signs and they go to the trials and try to lend support to the patients and victims of the laws. So the chapters are really the heart of NORML's grassroots outreach. We've got 600 plus lawyers involved with the organization, and the lawyers are at the vanguard of the most important litigation that happens in the United States, whether it's medical marijuana or legalization. We certainly do lobby. Both the chapters and the national office lobby at the local, state, and federal level. We litigate in all the courts, so we concentrate certainly at the appellate and Supreme Court levels, and educate. And so I've been at NORML so long, I've been here 25 years, that I've been here pre- and post-internet, and I can surely affirm that the difference today in the world of the internet, for example, I just got a notice from Facebook this morning indicating that 1.9 million people accessed NORML's Facebook page last week. In 1991,
Wow.
We would have been lucky to have talked to maybe a couple hundred people on the phone, or they sent us a fax, or they sent us a letter and we wrote them back a letter. So there are now millions and millions of people a week that are tapped into NORML's reform network.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I credit the internet with being partly responsible for the change in public attitude towards legalization and towards marijuana, because in the old days, the only information the public had was whatever the government or mainstream media told them, and They really didn't have anything to check it against. And
Totally.
if it wasn't for pioneers like Jack Herer and Lester Grinspoon attempting to start putting that real, truthful information out there, they were like the forefathers of all this, I guess. But now with the internet, when the government puts out some bogus study or some fake fact, you can look online and say, no, there was a study done in Israel, or there was a study done over here that says that it doesn't impair driving, or it doesn't kill brain cells, or it doesn't, So I think that that's partly responsible. I also think that you have to give a little credit to the money interests. I mean, when the people with money start getting involved and saying, hey, there's money to be made here and there's tax money to be made here, that's partly responsible as well. But I really think that without the foundation, without the basis of the decades of activism that took place, none of these things would be possible. The people that have, like yourself and many others who have stood up and fought and sacrificed and spoke out for so many years.
Well, it's much appreciated to hear you acknowledge that there's clearly a long history of reform that has now got us to the door of legalization in what I call Main Street cannabis commerce. And we totally embrace and love seeing capitalists and entrepreneurs now join the fray, because it just makes the coalition of reform that much more diverse. It certainly gives us much more resources. My whole life, I've largely bought marijuana illegally from a so-called dealer, and we appreciate and love the fact that for decades people risked their lives and liberty to grow great cannabis and to sell it to their friends and whatnot. But at some point, we obviously wanted to get to the place in history where you could just simply walk into a store as an adult and buy marijuana and pay some reasonable tax on it. And clearly, those individuals who are going to grow, market, infuse, test, and sell marijuana, they have a voice in all of this too. So in time, in say 20 or 30 years from now, when marijuana is completely legal in the United States, there probably will be at least two different entities that will be lobbying. One will be an entity who lobbies for the industry, for their interests, to keep taxes low and regulations in check. And then there'll be groups like NORML or something similar where we argue in favor of consumers. And while a lot of the time those two overlap, clearly in a free market economy, there's a natural friction between the sellers and the consumers. And NORML will always be there to represent the consumers' issues.
Well, that's certainly good to know, Alan. We need to take a short break now, but please don't go away. We'll be right back with more from Alan St. Pierre here on Blazin. All right, and we are back with Alan St. Pierre, Executive Director of NORML. Before the break, we had started discussing the corporatization or consumerization of the cannabis industry. And, when this whole transformation started, there were a lot of purists and I guess you might say hippie, maybe activists out there who are like, keep the big business out of pot and stuff. And I've always said, like, it's a very unrealistic thing to think that you would be able to legalize cannabis and have no one make money on it. I mean, it doesn't make any sense in our society. But I do think that there are legitimate pitfalls that we need to really be aware of. There are carpetbagger types who come in who have no respect for the plant or for as a medicine or as its history or anything of that nature, and they're just in it to make a quick buck, sometimes at the expense of their customers or patients. And there's also the risk of monopoly. I know that was one of the problems that held back the initiative in Ohio, that people felt that the government only allowed a very small handful of people to jump in on, growing or opening dispensaries. And it, again, like you were saying earlier about unnecessary obstacles being put in the way of this industry. And that's yet another about. How do you feel? What's the best way to try to avoid falling into these pitfalls of the monopolization of weed?
Well, there's no doubt that you rightly pointed out the big disaster of 2015 for reformers was this initiative in Ohio that was put forward by not donors, but investors who wanted to get the majority of the licenses, if the initiative was to win, to come to them. And that definitely set up an anti-free market, monopoly-like situation, and made it really easy for even longtime supporters of marijuana law reform to hold their nose and oppose the reforms. And it certainly lost. It lost by 65 to 35% loss, whereas places like Colorado and Washington and Oregon had passed their legalization initiatives at the 55 percentile. So something was very, very wrong with the Ohio model. And in the future, it's going to be an amalgam. It's going to be a combination of both old-school do-gooders, groups like NORML, the ACLU, who are just simply in favor of ending prohibition. We don't seek to sell marijuana. We're not looking to get rich off of it. But at the same time, there are now thousands of licensed marijuana businesses in the United States. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been raised and committed to these companies. And in our country, there's no doubt that they will be at the table arguing persuasively for considerations that make it good for their business. So, I think that California will probably give us the good example this year of that amalgam. Half the money will largely come from old school reformers, and half the money is going to come from marijuana-related businesses who certainly want to see prohibition end, but they're not going to make the same mistake that was done in Ohio and try to have all the economic benefits redound back to them.
Yeah, that's actually a perfect segue because my next question to you was going to be about California. I mean, it's obvious. I mean, the rest of the West Coast is legal now. Cali was the pioneer as far as not only cultivation in the Emerald Triangle for so many years, decades, but then the pioneer for medical marijuana, the first state, Prop 215. And so it seems odd that at this stage in the game where pot has become legalized in other states and has become so acceptable that Cali is kind of dragging their feet a bit. And similar to Ohio's measure, Prop 19 famously failed, and people were kind of left scratching their heads like, what happened? We thought we had this in the bag. So tell us a little about what is on the ballot for California moving forward and how it differs from Prop 19.
Sure. So the difference from Prop 19, those lessons were learned very soon after 2010 and were successfully applied in Oregon, Washington, and Alaska. And the lessons learned was you had to really address the concerns of parents and employers regarding drug testing and whether kids would have access to it, to set up regulatory schemes that police couldn't argue were permissive or would have allowed marijuana to leak out of the system. So those were successfully applied in these other states, and voters were like, yeah, let's vote for that. So you're right. California is the most important state in the union, period, just in general, politically speaking. And it is definitely the biggest market to produce marijuana, the biggest market to consume marijuana, and it has the longest history and culture associated with marijuana. So I would think that this year, when they have an initiative before them to legalize it, they're going to pass it, one, because these other states have already done so, and now they're almost embarrassed that they were not the first state, and they need to catch up. And two, is they just simply at this point recognize that the medical marijuana system there, particularly the new laws that have been passed there, are not going to maximize the opportunity to sell and use the product. So everybody should hopefully be locking arms in California in 2016 to pass legalization, because I don't think it's hyperbolic to say, as goes California, so goes the country, so goes the North, Central, and South American hemisphere, and so goes the European Union.
Wow, that's even, I realized that they were influential, but I didn't even think that it would be that much influence, that it would be such an international influence. New York passed what I consider a terrible medical marijuana law.
Yeah.
I realize that it will help some people, and for that reason, I applaud it. It is still in some way a step forward, but no flowers of any kind are allowed, and it just, again, looking to Colorado and seeing what they have going on there, I just don't understand. Like, they're trying to appear tough. Do you think that's what it is? They're trying to appear like, oh, we're not going to have this free-for-all permissive thing going on in our state, because New York is a liberal state. It always has been a liberal state.
Yeah.
Is it just an East Coast West Coast thing? What do you think is the reason for having such a prohibitive law?
You really kind of nailed it down thinking about the country. West Coast, from 1996 forward, all those states that went medical marijuana, once they passed the laws, it didn't take long that patients were able to access it. They could grow their own in a reasonable way. But here on the East Coast, pick the state: New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Maryland, the District of Columbia, Illinois for that matter. Once legislators, not voters, that's the other big distinction, on the West Coast, all of that was done by voter initiative.
Right. Here
on the East Coast, almost all of it was done by legislators, and when they did it, they made it much more complicated, put so many more rules in it. It took 2 to 3 years to roll these laws out, and you're right, New York laws is absolutely one of the worst ones in the scale of medical marijuana, and what it's caught up in is what we call the CBD only, or the vapor only epoch. And so what happened was, from 1996 to about 2012, all the medical marijuana laws that were reformed never addressed what type of marijuana people could consume, But starting once Sanjay Gupta had these two specials on CNN, and so many people started to learn about the therapeutic benefits of CBD as compared to THC, then we had 14 states, mainly very conservative states in the southern United States, but the two that stood out in the north were Minnesota and New York, two generally very liberal, tolerant states, but they have passed collectively the worst laws where patients really don't have access to the product. It's very expensive. They have to travel very far to get it. So you're right. New York's law is not functional, and is probably the companies that are involved in it are certainly hoping that much sooner than later full legalization happens so they can be sort of first in line for it.
Just for our listeners who may not know, let me just clarify. CBD is one of the cannabinoids like THC in cannabis, and the CBD cannabinoid has been identified as helping with pain relief, muscle relaxation, seizures, things of that nature, but it is not psychoactive. So it seems like a safe bet for politicians to say, oh, look, we're progressive. We passed a medical marijuana law, but it's just for kids with epilepsy or whatever. And what they don't realize, and what more and more medical and scientific professionals are saying, is that what they call the entourage effect needs to be taken into account, which is that these cannabinoids work together. They work off of each other, and you can breathe up or down for them to fine-tune the benefit, but in a vacuum, they don't necessarily work.
Exactly. I'm glad you made that point, because it really is a distinction. In some ways, these legislators in the South and in New York and Minnesota were sold a bill of goods that these products, quote, don't get you high, so therefore it's not marijuana. And the other point, too, regarding the geography of all this is that in places like New York, the legislature and the governor, they would literally say things like, well, we're passing an anti-California medical marijuana law here in New York. So it really did become a big geographic difference across the country.
Sure. I mean, I can understand the backlash. Cali's law is extremely permissive, but there is a middle ground also. It doesn't have to be everyone can get it or no one can get it. There should be a rational middle ground. I mean, I know you and I both believe that, in all honesty, everyone should be able to use it for insomnia or a headache if they choose to, because there's no reason you shouldn't. There's almost no negative effects, long-term effects. Every study's proven this. And even if there were some negative effects, adults should be allowed to use it. There are negative effects of alcohol and tobacco, well publicized.
Oh, yeah. I mean, just think about those of us who will watch TV and see those incessant ads about pharmaceuticals, and they, even in that short period of time they talk about them, they ram all those problems associated with them. Well, that makes good sense. Every time you and I take everything from an aspirin to smoke a joint to taking morphine that our doctors prescribe to us, we have to make a choice about benefits and alternatives. And marijuana is not perfect, but compared to these other drugs, it is so much safer and lacks toxicity that more often than not, it is the far more sane and rational and economic choice than pharmaceutical.
And that's another concern, obviously, is the pharmaceuticalization of cannabis.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, the pharmaceutical companies want to make money on this, and I understand that there should be pharmaceuticals based on cannabis available, but that shouldn't mean you're not allowed to consume the plant or grow the plant.
It's really regrettable, but some of those companies, and I won't even name them, just keep myself out of trouble in lawsuits, but those companies, their business model is largely predicated on the fact that the government still keeps the botanical, the flower, illegal. And so what they've done is they've gone out and hired former DEA agents and former people from the drug czar's office, people who spent their whole career arguing that marijuana is bad, marijuana is terrible. And now they walk through the revolving door of government. They work with the big pharmaceutical companies, and now they sit down with legislators and regulators and say, oh, well, medical marijuana is okay, but only if it comes in the pharmaceutical version that we've created.
Yeah, I mean, it's the difference to a patient between being able to grow your own medicine for free in your backyard or your closet, as opposed to spending lots of money to do it through an insurance company and a pharmaceutical company, and pretty much get the same effect, if not a better effect, with your own.
Absolutely. No, and they know it. Believe me, I've met with lobbyists from the pharmaceutical companies, and they've said, we have to spend $500 million. It takes us 10 years to get through the FDA, but folks who grow marijuana in a closet, dry it, put it in a mason jar, walk it out front, and sell it for $300 or $400 an ounce, they don't have any liability. They didn't pay any taxes. There was no regulations. So, yeah, they see medical marijuana clearly at the botanical level as a threat to their market share.
So it is in their best interest to see cannabis rescheduled as well, though. They just don't want to see it taken.
Oh.
They don't want to see it taken off the schedule, though.
Yeah, boy, I'm glad that you were able to point to something that is so important in the scheme of talking about marijuana in total, and that is even pharmaceutical companies are hamstrung, and so they are arguing, too, that it should at least be Schedule 2.
Sure, and again, just for any listeners who aren't totally familiar with the scheduling system, the Controlled Substances Act basically breaks different psychoactive substances down into a number of categories, Schedule 1 being considered the most dangerous and addictive with the least benefit, and cannabis is in there with... What else
Heroin and LSD.
Heroin and LSD, which is absurd also. And then cocaine and like oxycodone are like Schedule 2, right?
Right.
It's just absurd. A remnant of a bygone era of ignorance.
That's right.
that we've long outgrown. They just haven't caught up to it yet.
Yeah, by the way, I think that in the last, I think he's got 13 or 14 months of his presidency. I don't make bets. I'm not a soothsayer, but I would hardly be surprised if the last sort of marijuana rabbit that Mr. Obama pulls out of his hat might be, he has the ability as the executive to downschedule cannabis to at least 2. And I think that might be one of the last things he does that would help set up reforms for the next president, whoever they happen to be, because there's almost nobody left in the room. Even our opponents cannot argue with a straight face that marijuana should be in Schedule 1. So we're kind of at a point of political capitulation where nobody in the room argues that anymore.
That's true, and I was going to ask you that as well about Obama. In his first term, he was catching a lot of flack from the activists and the pro-pot people. And I kept saying to people, you have to wait till the second act. He's not going to do anything to legalize pot in because he wants to be reelected. And the last thing he wants is to appear soft on drugs or whatever. But we all know he was part of the Choom gang. He knows that pot is not this terrible thing that people make it out to be. So I said, just give him time. He'll come around. And he hasn't waved some magic wand and made it legal, but he has in steps and in increments made it a little easier, a little better, a little more rational. And he seems to continue to be moving in that direction. And I love second-term Obama. I wish second-term Obama was around for first term.
Yeah, no, you nailed it. I think that the first term, there was no way he was going to really go too far out on a limb. He definitely has a strong affinity with marijuana. He grew up smoking the best marijuana in the United States in the 1970s out in Hawaii. So he knows it. Yeah, he really does know it. But he's the father of teenagers, and he's the president, and it was pretty clear that he was going to take that path, being more prudent than not on this issue. But analytically speaking, when we go back and have to look at the history of all of this, it is amazing to see the things that he and his attorney generals have done. I won't bore people with details, but there are at least 6 or 7 things that he's done that has now made it so that when you and I go to Colorado, we can stand in line and buy marijuana and pay a tax on it. I can promise you, had Mr. McCain or Mr. Romney won either of those elections, then there's a good chance you and I might not even be talking today about all these great progressive things that have happened.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that he does get around to rescheduling it before he leaves office, and let's hope that we have a President Sanders come in and take it off the schedule altogether. That would be great.
Well, we're certainly going to see something momentous happen one way or the other in 2016. That is the nature of politics. And if Pass's prologue and some of the prognosticators are correct, marijuana law reform is going to happen certainly more in the next 5 to 10 years. East and West Coast will be the first places, New England, and then it'll take decades to infill the Oklahomas and Kansases of the world. But that's okay. If they want to be slow to the race, doesn't mean that those of us who don't want to live in more tolerant places just simply can't relocate and migrate.
Sure. On that note, final question. How many years do you think it will be before we see marijuana legal nationwide?
Well, I think realistically speaking, we'd probably get through 2 to 3 more election cycles. Election cycles run in 2 years. So by 20 to 2022, we should be near the end. I mean, maybe there could be the Oklahomas of the world that are going to hold out, but it seems implausible to me that by 2030, if you're an adult and you're using marijuana in your house, that you are subject to criminal or civil sanctions whatsoever.
That's amazing. Well, Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. Keep up the good fight.
Well, thank you, and I look forward to conversing with you soon, and would love to hang with you and enjoy the fruits of our labor. Talk to you soon, Bobby.
Take care, Alan. Well, for all you listeners out there who care about cannabis and would like to see it legal, I urge you to check out NORML.org for more info and to sign up. As Alan said, there are NORML chapters all over the country, so get involved and make a difference. That's it for this week. Please follow me on Twitter at Bobby Black, Facebook and Instagram at BobbyBlack420. Join me next week when my guest will be cannabis comic extraordinaire, Mr. Doug Benson. And if there's someone you'd like to see as a guest on Blazin, please go to our website, facebook.com/BlazinWithBB, and leave us a comment. Let us know. Until then, this is Bobby Black saying, Blaze on, brothers and sisters.